Hello and welcome to Week 6 FINA H101 Art Appreciation. This is being put on by Indiana University, Purdue University, Fort Wayne. I'm Aaron Schwartz again, and this week our topic will be the beholder. So we'll be talking about art's viewing audience, which is you and I and all of the people who have looked at works of art through history. We'll also talk about matching up our own contemporary perspectives to that of the period eye, that is, looking at a work of art from the point of view originally envisaged by the artist who created it. So with that in mind, let's look at our first image. Some of the best clues to the experience of historic art's original viewing audience are found in works that actually depict the beholder as part of the composition. We have such an image here in the illustrated pages from a prayer book that show the medieval king, Charles the Bald, kneeling before Christ on a cross in an act of devotion. This book was made for the personal use of the king in the early medieval period, in the mid-800 CE, and it's believed that kneeling, probably in front of the cross, was a part of his worship tradition. Now I want you to think about this and consider this as you look at this image. If he knelt while he was praying, and this prayer book was read only by him, why might there be an image of him kneeling in the book, in the pages? So think about that a little bit. If Charles here would have used this book during his worship, and he would have been kneeling in front of a cross during his worship, why does he need a picture of himself kneeling before the cross? It's kind of an interesting meta thing going on here. So take a moment to think why this might be necessary and why Charles might need this in his prayer book. And jot down some ideas in your notes. Our next work of art is known sometimes as the Dresden Madonna because it's located in a museum in Dresden, Germany. It was made by the Dutch artist Jan van Eyck in 1437. This type of painting is known as an altarpiece, or a panel designed to be placed on or above an altar in a church or other sacred space. It's just over about 1 foot high, so it's a pretty small piece in scale. When we say scale, we're just referring to the size of objects in relationship to other objects. Because of its small scale, it would have been portable and intended to be viewed close up. This suggests that this was intended for private devotion, when a person uses an object directly to aid them in personal prayer. In the central image, we see Jesus on the lap of his mother Mary, who is seated on a throne like a queen. Flanking this image in the 2 side panels is a scene of the Annunciation, that is, when the angel came to Mary, who was a virgin, and told her that she would have a child. On the right-hand side is an image of Mary in blue receiving this news. On the left, there's a standing man with wings representing the angel Gabriel, who is the one who delivered the news. There's one non-biblical figure here, though. It's the gentleman in the green kneeling down in front of Gabriel. This is what we call a donor figure. It's a portrait of the person who funded the creation of the artwork. The person or organization itself who supports a work of art or pays an artist to create a particular work of art is called the patron. The patron. You might have heard patron of the arts. This is what it's referring to. Because of the small scale of this altarpiece, it was likely used for private devotion in a 15th century home or family chapel, rather than in a publicly attended church. And art historians believe that the donor figure depicted in the left-hand panel would have been the primary beholder of this artwork. So again, think about why a donor would want his own portrait in this. What do you think his experience interacting with these images would have been? And what do you think his position in the composition of the altarpiece might indicate about where he saw himself in relation to his religious beliefs? So again, take a moment to think about why this donor would want to be positioned in such a way in relationship to these holy figures. This is another example of an altarpiece. It was created in 1432, just 5 years before the previous example, and it's by the same artist, Jan van Eyck. Like the previous example, too, it is painted with Christian scenes and is hinged so it can open up to reveal the images we are looking at here. Originally, it would have been displayed on or above an altar in a church or a chapel. However, unlike the altarpiece we just looked at, instead of being 1 foot tall, this one is about 11 feet tall. So instead of being for private devotion, this would have been for public devotion, or for all the people in a church to be able to see from a distance. It's highly detailed nonetheless, so there's another level at which an individual could interact with it more closely. There's a lot of imagery here, which I'm just going to summarize very briefly. The top center figure in red robe is the most important figure here. It's God. The woman beside him wearing blue is Mary, the Virgin Mother of Jesus, and the man in the green on the other side is John the Baptist, the man who baptized Jesus. The two nude figures at the top edges are Adam and Eve. The bottom central panel shows light shining down that represents the Holy Spirit. You can just see it at the top of the center bottom panel. Right below that, on a red platform, is a lamb, which represents Jesus, who was sacrificed like an innocent animal. From this brief tour of some of the imagery, you can understand how some of the images would have been more or less visible from a distance if it were displayed in front of the church and you were worshiping further back in the room. I'd like you to consider how the scale of this altarpiece would affect the experience of the viewer, who we will refer to as the beholder. How will the beholder's understanding and appreciation of this work of art vary based on where he or she was located? And who do you think might have been intended audience? And who do you think had the privilege of viewing it more closely? Also, take a good look at this. What type of figure is not present on this altarpiece that we saw in the previous one? There's kind of an interesting omission of a figure that we might expect to see here. So consider this. This large scale of this piece is going to affect a much larger intended audience in a very different way. Some people, because of where they sit and the access they have to the altarpiece, are just going to have a different visual experience with the piece. We do know that people of sort of higher economic and social standing tended to have seats a little bit closer to the front. So what might that be telling us about people's relationship to the scenery that they're able to see in a piece like that? Jot down some ideas. Think about the messages being conveyed with a piece of this scale. Let's take a look at this painting. It's an early Baroque oil painting called The Conversion of St. Paul, and it's done by Caravaggio. I'll explain this image in more detail, but before I do so, I'd like you to pause the video and just take a moment to jot down a description of the scene. How would you describe what's going on here? Before you know the story of it, can you put together what's happening in this scene? Then we'll move on here. So, what we're seeing here is a very typical example of Baroque art. It has a high contrast between light and shadow, known as tenebrism or dramatic illumination, and all of the forms depicted in the painting, both the horse and the human figures, are depicted in twisting dramatic postures. Plus, the expressions on the faces of the figures contain a lot of dramatic emotion to communicate a moment of action in the narrative. I'll now want to share with you what's being depicted. St. Paul, who ultimately became one of Jesus' disciples, started out as a persecutor of Christians. One day, as he was riding on his horse to the city of Damascus, he was struck down by the word of God, who told him he would convert and become a Christian. He was so shocked he fell off his horse in a moment of excitement and terror. In this painting of the story, the artist Caravaggio chose to depict this particular climactic scene when St. Paul has just fallen off his horse and is illuminated by the light of divine conversion. Knowing all this, I'd like you to now sort of jot down in your notes on why Caravaggio chose this scene and why he presented it in the manner in which he did. Do you think he expected the beholders of this painting to be Christian? What would this scene mean to them, and why would it be more meaningful than some other incident within the story? So take a moment to think about why we're presenting this particular moment of the scene and why Caravaggio might want to show it in this particular way. Does he assume that his audience must be Christian? Why or why not? Jot down some ideas on that. I'd like to talk about that Caravaggio painting in terms of its pictorial context, which is defined as the context in which a work of art is displayed, where it originally hung and how it was originally viewed, whether in a museum, a church, or private domestic setting, and is particularly important to consider in situations when artwork is displayed side by side with other works of art, so its style and subject matter might have been compared by its original beholders. You see 3 paintings here, all painted at around the same time, about 1600, but each showing different personal styles. The one in the center is by Carracci, and the other 2 on the ends are by Caravaggio. And you recognize the conversion of St. Paul on the left that we just looked at. They were all displayed next to each other on the walls of Santa Maria del Popolo, an Augustan church in Rome. The painting on the right is entitled The Crucifixion of Peter, and accordingly St. Peter is the central figure, showed tied upside down to a cross. You can probably pretty easily recognize Caravaggio's personal style across these 2 paintings. In both, we see tenebrism, the contorted bodies, even his attempt to almost merge the space of the painting with that of the beholder by depicting active figures in the foreground nearest to the viewer. The conversion of St. Paul on the left, the horse's rear seems to angle out of the painting towards us, and similarly in the other Caravaggio painting, the squatting figure in brown pants shoves his posterior towards the viewer and exposes his very dirty heels to the beholder's view. Carracci's work, in the center though, is in a more classically idealized Renaissance style, and although it's very melodramatic, you don't have a sense of intense personal emotion or agony that Caravaggio tends to display. The Carracci painting shows the Assumption of Mary, another story from Christian tradition, which describes how Jesus' mother Mary, upon her death, was drawn up into heaven rather than dying and leaving her earthly body like most mortals. Now, after all of that explanation, I'd like you to consider, how does the relationship of these paintings impact the beholder's understanding or appreciation of them? How do their styles and their subject matter complement each other? When you imagine them hanging side by side in a church, do you think that this is a successful trio of paintings? Do you think it works well that the central image is rather different from the side images? Think about that for a moment, and then we'll move on to the next slide. Here you see those same paintings in situ. In situ refers to when a work of art or architecture is seen in its original physical and geographic location. The geographic context here is Rome. The paintings are in the Cerci chapel of the Church of Santa Maria del Popolo in Rome. Being in this church, they are also in their architectural context, that is simply the structure, building, or part of a building in which the work is displayed. They are in a side chapel, that is a small alcove off of the main worship space of the church. Now, as you're looking at this and jotting down some notes, I'd encourage you to try to describe this architectural context. What does it look like? How does it feel? I'd also like you to consider how seeing them in situ, in their architectural context, would affect the experience of the beholder. Keep in mind that a viewer standing or worshiping in front of them would need to look up to view them. The bottom center of the painting starts at about the top of the average person's head. The bottom of the Caravaggio paintings are higher than head height. And I would really like you to think about, from your perspective as a student, what does this change about your appreciation of the works and the overall scene. Would you prefer to look at them or other paintings like this as three flat images side by side? How do you think your experience would differ even more if you were to take a field trip and see these in person? And if I could put you guys all on a plane to Rome, I would do so, but that is not in my power. And when we talk about things like this is an inherent limitation of a class like this, particularly an internet class. We do miss when you just look at these flat images on a computer screen or in your textbook. You're missing so much of the story, because so much of what we'll get out of a work of art is embodied in the context and where and how you experience it. So take a moment to consider what being in that chapel would be like. Use your imagination, try to think about it, and does it alter your relationship to these paintings and how you might have understood these paintings? Think about that for a moment and jot down some ideas, and then we'll move on to a different kind of subject matter. What you see coming up on this slide is a quote from the biblical book of Judith, chapter 13, verses 2 through 14. And I'd like you, once all of this comes up on the screen, to pause the video and read it over. Read this story. It's a fascinating little story. If you're not familiar with the book of Judith, it's not in all versions of the Bible. It's used by Catholics and by some Christian Orthodox traditions, but it tends not to be in Protestant Bibles. So take a moment to read this story. And then we'll take a look at an illustration of the story in the next slide. So pause it, read it, and then we'll move on. Here is another painting by Caravaggio. Can you tell he's one of my favorites? I'm hoping you recognize his style here. This is showing Judith and Holofernes. Now, to give you a little background to both the painting and the quotes you just read on the previous slide, Judith was a young and very charming widow whose city was under siege by the Assyrian army. The general of that army was Holofernes. He's the unlucky guy getting beheaded here. In order to get close enough to kill him and save her city, she went out to his camp and offered herself to him as his bride. She said, "If you marry me, my city will surrender." He accepted her proposal and celebrated by getting completely drunk. Judith then took advantage of the opportunity that she had created. She took a dagger that had been smuggled in by her servant and chopped his head off, which disrupted his army, to say the least, and ultimately caused them to leave her city. So now, with this information, you are what we call an informed viewer. How do you see this painting differently than if you had no background on it? Also consider why the artist depicted this particular image. What impact did this have on the beholders? Of the entire story, this is the moment Caravaggio chose to depict. I'd also like to mention the term iconographic tradition, which is the tradition of depicting ideas or stories in conventional ways, or in the same way. Most Christians, who were mostly Catholic at this time that this painting was created, would have recognized these characters immediately as Judith and Holofernes, because Judith was always depicted either beheading or holding the head of a bearded man, the Assyrian general Holofernes. Can you think of any iconographic traditions from our modern era? Any scenes, and they don't need to be religious, that we automatically recognize and know the story behind because we've seen them so often and heard the story so many times? So think about that for a moment. Do we have iconographic traditions in the 21st century? If you really think about it, I think you might be able to come up with some. The story of Judith and Holofernes has been represented by different artists in different ways, in different eras, and for different beholders. This painting shows the same scene as the one we just looked at, but was done a little more than 200 years later, in the early 1820s, by Spanish artist Francisco Goya. Now consider, how is the style and content of this painting different than Caravaggio's, and what aspects of the story's iconographic tradition are shared by the two paintings? Also, why do you think the style of the two paintings is so different? Remember, although it still seems like a long time ago to us, Goya's viewing audience was living in a very different, more modern era in 1823 than Caravaggio's beholders were in 1599. How do you think Goya adapted his scene to meet his beholders' tastes and expectations? So take a moment to jot down some ideas about the differences between these two representations. The intended beholder for Goya's Judith and Holofernes was actually himself. He painted this as a decoration for his own home. What you see here is a reconstruction of the pictorial context and architecture in which he displayed his paintings in his home, a special gallery known as the Black Room. In Goya's later years, between about the ages of 72 and 76, he created a series of very violent paintings, known as his black paintings, for displaying in this space. We can see his painting of Judith and Holofernes located here on the back wall, but all of his black paintings depicted monsters and witches and other intense, haunting themes, reflective both of his fear of insanity and his increasingly bleak outlook on humanity, from which he had become progressively withdrawn. Now, considering this, how would Goya's experience as the beholder of this particular painting, this subject matter, in this particular room, and from his particular personal circumstances, have affected his appreciation and understanding of this image? Can you put yourself in Goya's head for a moment and consider sitting in the middle of this room looking around at these pictures? Do you think he was looking at this from a Christian perspective? For what other reasons might he have chosen this subject matter of Judith and Holofernes? Also, knowing the context of its creation and display, do you look at this painting different? Is the fact that it's in this room with all of these others rather disturbing pictures influence our relationship and our interpretation of the story? Our next work of art brings us closer to today and closer to our own period I. To reiterate, period I refers to looking at a work of art from a point of view originally envisaged by the artist. This is Lichtenstein's Thinking of Him from 1963. You see, it's a rather cartoonish, and it almost looks like it's printed in newspaper comic strip ink. We can relate to it and recognize it as 20th century art, also on account of the clothing and the hairstyles and so on. This is an example of pop art. That's short for popular art, a mid-20th century visual arts movement occurring mostly in the United States and England that dealt with images from everyday culture, such as entertainment and everyday objects such as Campbell's soup cans, and tried to elevate these popular subjects to the status of high art. Now, take a look at this work, and from your perspective as the beholder, is this old-fashioned looking today? Or is it still acceptable as quote-unquote current culture? I expect you might have different but interesting opinions on this. So take a moment to look at this and consider your gut reaction. Did it look dated? Did it look old to you when it popped up on the screen? Or did this still look modern and fresh? Consider your opinions as you write your notes. We've considered some artworks in their original contexts, on the walls of a Roman chapel, in Goya's Black Room, but most of us, most of the time, see art in museums. The sculpture you see at the top of the stairs here is in the Louvre in Paris. It's an ancient Greek sculpture called the Nike of Samothrace. We'll look at the statue itself in more detail in a little bit here. But first I want you to think about its relationship to beholders in its present installation in the Louvre in Paris, a place very, very far removed from its ancient home. An installation, by the way, refers to a work of art presented in a 3D environment. Here you see the statue beneath a large window, bathed in light atop a grand stairway. I'd like you to consider the clean, bright presentation of this old, broken statue. It was dug up out of the dirt, it's missing its head and some other parts. Is this type of display effective for engaging your interest as the beholder, as a modern museum visitor? What does it bring to mind? What effect does it have? Could it change the meaning of the work of art? Is it even important that it's ancient Greek when it's presented in such a radically different context? So think for a moment about this piece being at the Louvre, this massively huge museum, turning to go up a staircase. You see this thing installed, as you see it in this slide, at the top of the staircase. What's your reaction to it? Do you have any kind of reaction to it? Here you can see a little closer view of the Nike of Samothrace. In Greek mythology, Nike is a goddess who personifies victory, and Samothrace is where this was discovered. The statue was made in about 200 BCE, so more than 2,200 years ago, and it would have had a head and two arms and would have stood on top of the prow of a ship as a reminder of naval victory. And in the next slide, I'll show you a reconstruction of what she may have looked like. These artist renderings show how we think the Nike of Samothrace would have originally been positioned on a larger memorial. This was essentially an ancient war memorial commemorating those who died in a very large naval battle. Now, my question for you then, is it better to see an ancient artwork with all of this information, with diagrams and reconstructions, a little bit of backstory, so that we can better understand the experience of its original and intended beholders? Or is it more suitable today to just admire it as a beautiful statue, like in the Louvre Museum installation? Which, by the way, I will point out, in the Louvre, the Nike of Samothrace is simply perched on the top of this staircase. There is a little text sign telling you what it is and when it dates from, but that's it. There is no other information with the piece in the museum setting. So consider whether or not you think that is the best way to display a work of art that's over 2,000 years old and would have had a radically different context to the original beholders. Are we missing something? Is the Louvre doing a disservice to this piece when it displays it in such a manner? Or is this okay? Is this just suitable to admire it as something beautiful? So there's no correct answer to this. In fact, curators debate this a lot still today. It's going to be a matter of opinion to some, a matter of principle to others. But take a moment to consider where you stand on this issue. Should modern curators be obligated to present some sort of context for works of art, particularly ancient works of art? Or is it, in this day and age, simply acceptable to you to display them as visual pieces without that context? Also, I'd like you to think about this. What would you think about restoring the arms or the head? Why do we tend to admire ruins as beautiful? Interestingly, to the ancient Greeks who made the Nike of Samothrace, this broken statue would either have needed to have been repaired or disposed of. They never would have considered this fit for public view. The ancient Greeks hated incomplete things, which is so ironic because nowadays when we think ancient Greece, we tend to think broken statues. So jot down some ideas about that. Where do you stand on the ethics of reconstructing ancient works of art? If the Louvre decided to construct a head and arms for the Nike of Samothrace, is that ethical? Should they do something like that? Again, there's no right or wrong answer. I'm not going to grade you on this answer, but it will be helpful to you to try to think about where you stand on these issues and how you want to articulate an argument one way or the other. So keep that in mind. That's all for this week. nothing else to talk about here. Next week we'll be talking about the figure, representations of the body, and so on in art. Please make sure that you are checking up on your writing assignments and due dates and all of that on the Blackboard site. If you have any questions or concerns, please email me and let me know about them. Either I or my teaching assistant can get on that and try to fix any issues that you're having right away. So, thank you very much, and I will talk at you next week.